Hello, my name is Lois Simons, and I'm the owner of Gardening by Nature's Design. This garden here in the Lakeshore district is Marianne and Richard's garden, and I came to this garden. There were already some elements here. I'm going to talk today about design and hopefully about the implementation, some practical aspects of the implementation of a design. When I came to this garden, there were already some boulders, but they were scattered throughout the garden and they had no relationship to one another. There was a dry creek bed, but you couldn't see it. This was the challenge that was posed to me. How could I connect these boulders and bring to everyone's attention the dry creek bed? I'd like to point out to you how I rearranged the stones that were already here, and so that there's fluidity and continuity in the garden between the boulders, the stones, and also how it introduces you to the garden. So it naturally allows your eye to flow from one stone to the other, bringing you to the beautiful boulder and the entrance to the pathway. So it's bringing you to the boulder and into the garden, to the maple and the plants surrounding the maple, as well as bringing your eye to the beginning and starting of a path. Then you follow these stones and you follow it this way, you're brought to this extraordinary boulder. What happens here is you're brought to the lines of this boulder. Before, when I saw this boulder, it was extraordinary, but it was static. And now, because of how you're introduced to the boulder, you see the curves and the lines of the boulder, and they draw you into what I had proposed, which is let's put in a wetlands. And the wetlands will connect this boulder to the dry creek bed that is behind it. And I will raise the dry creek bed, which was very shallow. There were only like 1-2 courses of stone. And I will build it up so that you can notice that there is indeed a dry creek bed and that there's a relationship now between this beautiful boulder through the wetlands to the dry creek bed. I just want to point out how landscape can meet architecture. We have here, entering the house, these extraordinarily beautiful cut stone entering the house. What an incredible entrance. And then we have the stone in the garden. Do you see how it complements the steps going up into the house so that there's an ambience between the two? And it retains its natural look, and yet it complements and works with the architecture that leads us into the house. We enter the garden path. And once again, the stone leads our way into the garden path and into the garden, so that the path itself is indeed a garden path, not separate from the garden, because the stone will bring us to the path and into the beautiful maple bed. We wanted to keep the beautiful curve of the path, so we accentuated it with stones along the path, and we built up the entrance to the dry creek bed. So it has a presence, and it says, I'm here, I'm a dry creek bed, enter me. And you can see they have a sitting area here so that they can sit from here and enter the dry creek bed as they're resting, relaxing in their garden. Bringing you into this dry creek bed, you can see that the stone is creating different vignettes and openings, windows into the garden. Here we have the maple bed is introduced to us, and now the dry creek bed with the wetlands and its plants are introduced to us in this garden. And see how coherent it is. It falls and flows naturally. There's a fluidity and a continuity. And one feature enhances the other feature. You see how the wetland enhances the dry creek bed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the plants. There were already some plants in this garden, but they were not faring. Well, the first step we took is we did a soil test and a filtration test. And what we discovered was that there were certain nutrients that were lacking in the soil, and that the soil itself was a sandy loam about 12 inches down, and then it turned to a clay soil. So this informed us in terms of what kind of irrigation, our approach to the irrigation, and of course in bringing amendments to the soil. So we're not just placing plants in soil. There's a relationship. Everything is vibrant and alive, and we recognize that. And we work with that so that the plants that were yellow and rather small are now flourishing and green. And I will show you certain examples of how incredibly well things are flourishing and green. Of course, we worked with the deodar cedar that's here in the garden, the 2 maple trees, the spruce, and there were a couple of Arctostaphylos. That's the manzanita, the ground cover. There were two here, and there were the manzanita shrubs, the Howard McMinns, along the dry creek bed. And they wanted to expose the bark in this Howard McMinn along the creek bed. These shrubs will be further pruned. We wanted them to come back into full health before pruning them. So they're a bit dense on the top, and in the fall we will, after they have had their berries dropped and stuff, we will then go ahead and do a pruning. There was juniper here. We just kept that. And what we did is we worked with the Arctostaphylos or manzanita emerald carpet. We put in another one to create a pattern, and we put several in the backdrop there to connect the area around the maple to the front of the garden. And we put a point raised Arctostaphylos in the back there that will also flow down the hillside and has a nice deep green color. To act as counterpoint, we put in the Coyote bush pigeon point, Baccharis Pilularis. And so it has a different texture, and it's a lighter green. And we also put in a different Arctostaphylos, this Arctostaphylos or manzanita Pacific mist. It's a wonderful manzanita to put by water features, because as it grows, it will come down and it will arch. So unlike the emerald carpet that stays close and mounds and stays close to the slope, this Pacific mist will accentuate the slope and have the kind of fluidity that you would see with water and water features, mimicking that. And it also has a lighter color, so it's a nice contrast. So what I want to say is that we don't simply plant a plant. Oh, I like this plant, I'll put it in the garden. What we plant is community of plants that have a relationship with one another. And just like the stone, how we change the stonework so that there's a continuity and the eye just naturally flows from one stone element to the other, so too there's a pattern so that your eye flows from one plant to the other. And it actually sees those plants, but it also sees the relationship between plants. And what you have is a coherent whole, and what you have is you're creating in both of these ways of a sense of place. A place where you can be and rest, and it creates a sense of calm and peace. And that's what we like to create in our gardens. Then what we did, we used plants. Remember how I connected the boulder to the dry creek bed with the wetlands and raised the dry creek bed. And then we placed 2 grasses behind the dry creek bed. And behind that are some more plants, notably the Ceanothus dark star. And that Ceanothus dark star, very architectural in its growth, much like the deodar cedar. So it's going to mirror the deodar cedar, and it's going to come up to 5-6 feet. So it's going to bridge the garden to the deodar cedar and to the shrub Arctostaphylos, Howard McMinn's. And so it's going to arch, and it has this beautiful, rich, lilac, deep purple flower in the springtime. So what we're doing, we're extending the garden back. We're giving it perspective and depth. All of a sudden, instead of it being the focus of one thing, it's the focus of a whole array of things that are connected. So here we are in the sitting area in this garden. And what we did, and this is one of the permaculture principles, is to utilize the materials that are here on this property. So when we dug out the wetlands, we used that soil to build a nice hill here. And what that does is it creates an intimate space here. It embraces the sitting area. It's no longer has the sense of being just flat and out in the open. Instead, it's a nice resting area that's protected and has a sense of privacy. It also is placed so that you can really appreciate the dry creek bed and its entry, as well as the rest of the garden. This hill that we created has a number of features. We have the Yerba Buena coursing through the garden, interspersed with Heuchera, the coral bells. And in the center of the bed, we have a mountain mahogany. It's a beautiful, beautiful plant. So it's used to being browsed by deer. So it can be as little as 3 feet in maturity or 15 feet tall. There are deer in this garden. Every night there are deer that are in this garden. So that's been a challenge. In order to protect the plants that the deer like to browse, is we've actually placed stakes around the plants initially for them to have the opportunity to root and settle in. Otherwise, the deer would just simply browse on them and actually pull them out of the ground. So that's one thing we've had to do. In certain areas, we put bird netting over just to allow the entire area to establish. As you can see, it's doing very well, and it does well with being browsed, so we're going to allow that to happen. Also in the background here, I mentioned before that we found the nutrients in the soil to be lacking. This is an evergreen currant, which is a ribes, and what it is, it's a berry plant. And it's one of the few berry plants native to California that retains its leaves all year long. This evergreen currant was pretty meager and yellow, not doing well at all. As you can see, it is flourishing right now and totally green. So this is how we approach gardens. We approach it literally from the ground up. Over here is another berry plant, a native California native currant. It is the Ribes sanguineum Claremont. And as you can see, it's doing beautifully. Right now, it's kind of enmeshed in the evergreen currant, but it will actually grow to be about 8-10 feet tall. And we're going to semi-exfoliate it so that it will go on the wall of this house and be a wonderful backdrop, a natural backdrop for the garden. So the house, the structure, and the garden are meeting, but in a very friendly fashion. Over here, backing the sitting area is the California huckleberry. And it will actually have huckleberries. It loves living in the shade and stuff. And they're like a very small blueberry, very intense. When I've been up at Sea Ranch collecting the huckleberries, 5 feet, 10 feet away are deer also collecting the huckleberries. So the deer will be very happy with this garden. Instead of creating a barrier to the deer, we're creating a home and working with them as best we can. So in this area here, as I spoke about, we have the Ceanothus dark star, which will come architecturally up to 6 feet and spread out. And then we have behind it the Howard McMinn Arctostaphylus. And here, unlike over by the creek bed, we're going to allow this to be a shrub. It's one of the few manzanitas that as it grows, it actually can retain all of its leaves lower down, and if it's properly maintained. And so it will form just a little backdrop here. I just want to point out to you that the depth of this perspective, it just draws you in. You're totally in this wild landscape now. Very natural, wild landscape. And it just draws you in. So we're shifting perspective, and that's part of design, is shifting your perspective and adding some depth and a quality so that you're entering into different spaces, but naturally. So I just want to point out to you that, and to me that feels really important, especially in California, where we have a tendency to drought, and we're currently in a very severe drought, to bring water features, natural water features into the garden. Oftentimes, when it's possible, I will actually take the water from the roof of the house and bring it into a wetlands in a dry creek bed. But even so, if I'm simply even capturing water in these dry creek beds and the wetlands, what it does, if the soil is viable, it actually raises the water table. And what that does is that it allows the plants, once they've established, to draw from that table for a longer period of time so that we are less dependent on irrigation to keep these plants alive and flourishing.